Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, you've just endured almost 15 minutes of my rather smug empiricism, and I suspect several of you, particularly those with backgrounds in philosophy and the humanities, are experiencing what we Germans so beautifully call Fremdschämen on my behalf, quite right too. Allow me now to commit that most un-German of acts, a public self-correction, though I shall endeavour to make it entertaining, for there's nothing quite so tedious as watching someone eat humble pie without proper seasoning. In my previous address, I spoke rather glibly about cognitive profiles and their distribution across disciplines. How delightfully reductionist of me. How charmingly 19th century. I managed, in one rhetorical flourish, to commit the very sin I was denouncing. The oversimplification of complex phenomena into neat, color-coded categories. The truth, and here's where it gets delicious, is that the scientific trainer philosophy and the net of brains community represent precisely the opposite of what I implied. They are not rallying cries for the mathematically minded to lord over the humanistically inclined. They are, in fact, attempts to heal what Habermas might call the split rationality of our age, this tragic divorce between Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft that has left us all intellectually impoverished. You see, I fell into the oldest trap in the academic book, mistaking instrumental reason for reason itself. How mortifying. It's rather like confusing a thermometer with the concept of health. Let me correct my earlier taxonomy with appropriate humility. When I spoke of abstract reasoning, I conveniently forgot that the philosophers, those masters of negative dialectics, those critics of instrumental reason too, stand shoulder to shoulder with the physicists in the pantheon of abstract thought. Indeed, one might argue, and Adorno certainly would, that the physicist who cannot philosophize is merely a sophisticated calculator, whilst the philosopher who dismisses empiricism is simply writing poetry with unnecessary complexity. The scientific trainer certification isn't about replacing Heidegger with histograms. It's about recognizing that Dasein and data points might actually have something to say to each other. Revolutionary thought, I know. Here's where I must perform my most elaborate mea culpa. The pedagogues and humanities scholars in our community, particularly those who've joined the net of brains, are not refugees from rigor. They are, in fact, double agents of the highest order. These are the individuals who've mastered both Foucault and factor analysis, who can discuss Derrida and standard deviations with equal fluency. They suffer not from cognitive limitation, but from cognitive isolation, surrounded by colleagues who've mistaken the absence of method for methodological innovation. Imagine, if you will, being a classically trained philosopher trapped in a department where mindfulness is considered the apex of intellectual achievement. It's rather like being a sommelier at a beer pong tournament. You have skills that are simultaneously overqualified and underappreciated. In my earlier remarks, I perpetuated that most pernicious of false dichotomies, the split between people-oriented and data-oriented approaches. How embarrassingly binary of me, how disappointingly digital in a beautifully analog world. The scientific consultant training that is going to launch in 2026, and here's where it gets properly interesting, explicitly rejects this split. It recognizes that understanding human beings requires both the precision of measurement and the subtlety of interpretation. It's not about choosing between Kant and correlation coefficients. It's about recognizing that categorical imperatives and categories of data might actually be discussing the same phenomenon from different vantage points. This is what the Frankfurt School understood and what Silicon Valley seems to have forgotten. That instrumental reason without critical reflection is not reason at all. It's merely efficiency in fancy dress. Let me paint you a portrait of the most tragic figure in our field, the humanities scholar with scientific sensibilities, They arrive at L&D conferences armed with Bourdieu's theory of social capital and a solid understanding of statistical power. They can quote Habermas on communicative action whilst calculating effect sizes in their head. And what do they find? Colleagues who think hermeneutics is a type of yoga and epistemology is probably something you shouldn't do in public. These individuals don't need to be rescued by the STEM brigade. They need to be recognized as the bridges they are, the translators between worlds, the healers of the split rationality that plagues our profession. They are not the problem, they are quite literally the solution. Here's where I must confront my most egregious error, the fetishization of measurement. In my zeal to combat the unmeasurable, I forgot that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Einstein said that, not me, a physicist with philosophical sensibilities, how perfect. The critical theory tradition, which informs the more sophisticated versions of the scientific trainer philosophy, reminds us that measurement without meaning is merely number worship. It's the difference between knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing, to butcher Oscar Wilde. When we measure learning outcomes, are we measuring learning or merely performance? When we quantify engagement, are we capturing commitment or merely compliance? These are not statistical questions, they are philosophical ones. And any approach that ignores them is not scientific. It's scientistic, which is rather like the difference between medicine and wearing a white coat. What I failed to mention, rather conveniently, is that the net of brains isn't a gathering of number crunchers congratulating themselves on their p-values. It's an attempt to create what one might call, borrowing from Hegel, a synthesis, though without the teleological baggage, thank you very much. It's a space where phenomenology meets psychometrics without either apologizing. Narrative analysis sits comfortably beside regression analysis. Qualitative depth and quantitative breadth are seen as dance partners, not boxing opponents. The question, what does this mean, is as important as, is this significant? In other words, it's attempting something rather more ambitious than I implied, the reunification of human reason in the service of human development. My previous address, I now realize with appropriate horror, was itself a manifestation of instrumental reason run amok. I reduced the complex ecology of human development to a simple problem of measurement and management. How very corporate of me. The Frankfurt School critique, which should be required reading for anyone claiming to be scientific about human development, points out that this reduction of human potential to measurable outcomes is itself a form of domination. It's the logic of the factory applied to the human soul. The scientific trainer training in its more enlightened moments recognizes this. It's not trying to turn humans into better robots. It's trying to help robots remember they're human. So let me reissue my invitation, properly chastened and significantly wiser. The scientific trainer certification and the net of brains community are not calling for a triumph of empiricism over humanism. They're calling for something far more radical, the end of that false distinction altogether. We need the pedagogues who've read their Piaget and their p-values. We need the philosophers who can navigate both Nietzsche and null hypotheses. We need the psychologists who understand that the psyche is more than what's measurable, and the sociologists who know that society is more than the sum of its statistics. This is not about the quantitative colonizing the qualitative. It's about recognizing that any approach to human development that ignores either is like trying to understand music by only reading the sheet music or only feeling the vibrations. The supreme irony, and I'm rather enjoying this now, is that in advocating for scientific rigor, I demonstrated precisely the kind of uncritical thinking I was supposedly opposing. I created my own four-color personality model, the enlightened empiricists, the hapless humanists, the statistical saints, and the innumerate innocents. How perfectly absurd, how beautifully self-defeating, how very human. The truth is that the best practitioners in our field, the ones who actually transform organizations rather than merely rearranging them, are those who refuse these false categories. They're the ones who understand that truth is complex, that humans are paradoxical, and that any method that claims to have all the answers probably hasn't understood the questions. My dear colleagues, I stand before you properly corrected and appropriately humbled. The scientific trainer philosophy, properly understood, is not about choosing sides in the great methodological wars. It's about recognizing that the war itself is the problem. We need not choose between meaning and measurement, between depth and data, between critical thinking and calculation. We desperately need, both. And more. We need the wisdom to know when each is appropriate, the skill to apply both with excellence, and the humility to recognize that neither alone is sufficient. The net of brains at its best is not a network of the numerically superior. It's a gathering of those who refuse the false comfort of methodological monopoly. It's for those brave enough to be rigorous without being rigid, scientific without being scientistic, humanistic without being woolly. So yes, join us, but not to triumph over the enumerate. Join us to heal the split that makes some of us enumerate and others illiterate in human complexity. Join us to prove that intelligence isn't about choosing between heart and head, but about having both in constant creative conversation. After all, the greatest tragedy of our field isn't that we have too many people who can't do statistics. It's that we've created a world where statistical literacy and human literacy are seen as opposing teams rather than essential partners. The revolution we need isn't empirical or humanistic, it's both, it's all. It's the recognition that any approach to human development that isn't paradoxical, complex, and slightly contradictory probably hasn't understood humans at all. Thank you for your patience with my earlier pomposity and your tolerance of my current self-flagellation. Both, I suspect, were equally necessary. For those interested in joining what we might more accurately call the reconciliation, rather than the resistance, information about the scientific trainer certification and the Net of Brains community awaits. We promise rigorous standards, critical thinking, empirical grounding, philosophical depth, and the recognition that anyone who claims to have it all figured out definitely doesn't, including me, especially me, delightfully, paradoxically me. But wait, as Hegel would insist and Lacan would gleefully confirm, we're not done yet. For those of you familiar with the dialectical tradition, you'll recognize that we've just performed the first two steps of a rather elaborate intellectual waltz. Thesis, antithesis. But where, pray tell, is the synthesis? As Lacan reminds us, there is always this glissement incessant du signifié sous le signifiant, this incessant sliding of the signified beneath the signifier. We grasp for meaning, pin it down with our points décapitants, our quilting points, only to watch it slip away again, always elsewhere, always deferred. The moment we think we've captured the truth about L&D, whether empiricist or humanist, it's already escaped, laughing at our pretensions to finality. So I must promise you, there will be a third speech, perhaps a fourth. The dialectic continues, but here's the delicious secret. This isn't intellectual masturbation. This is training for the age of intelligence. Let me step out of my performative paradoxes for a moment and speak directly to you, my fellow travelers, in this strange landscape of corporate learning. We are entering what can only be called the age of intelligence, where artificial intelligence doesn't replace human thought but amplifies it, challenges it, makes it more urgent than ever. In this new era, the ability to shift between registers, to be fiercely empirical one moment and philosophically nuanced the next, to deploy savage wit when needed and gentle wisdom when required, isn't intellectual showmanship, it's survival. Consider what's happening in California right now. Governor Newsom has learned something the Democrats failed to grasp when Michelle Obama declared, "When they go low, we go high." Noble sentiment, disastrous strategy. Newsom is using Trump's own social media playbook against him, meeting fire with fire, meme with meme, aggression with aggression. Not because he's abandoned his principles, but because he's learned that sometimes you need to speak the language of the battle you're in, not the one you wish you were fighting. This is precisely what we need in L&D, the ability to switch codes, to be the empiricist when facing the CFO, the humanist when coaching the wounded, the philosopher when designing systems, and yes, the provocateur when the organization needs shaking from its stupor. My first speech, that aggressive, slightly obnoxious empiricist rant, wasn't wrong. Sometimes you need that voice to cut through the fog of feel-good facilitation. My second speech, all reconciliation and nuance, wasn't wrong either. Sometimes you need to build bridges, not burn them. The third speech, when it comes, won't be wrong either. Because in the age of intelligence, being right isn't about having one correct position. It's about having the range, the flexibility, the sheer intellectual athleticism to dance between positions as the moment demands. The scientific trainer certification and the net of brains aren't selling you a dogma. They're offering you a gymnasium for the mind, a place where you can practice these shifts, develop this range, build the intellectual muscle memory that lets you be both and rather than either or. Because here's what I've learned in my years of tilting at L&D windmills. The problem isn't that we're too scientific or too humanistic. It's that we're too rigid. We pick a stance and defend it to the death, when what we need is the fluidity to flow between stances like water finding its way through stone. In practical terms, this means when your CEO demands ROI, give them regression analyses that would make a data scientist weep with joy. When your team needs inspiration, channel your inner poet and make them believe in possibility. When the consultants arrive with their four-color personalities, demolish them with science if necessary, or play along if strategic. When you need to survive, adapt. When you need to thrive, transcend. This isn't relativism. It's pragmatism with a PhD. It's the recognition that in a world where AI can outcalculate us but can't outthink us, our superpower is precisely this ability to shift, to play, to dance between paradigms. The net of brains promises not certainty but capability, not answers but agility, not dogma but dexterity. In the age of intelligence, these are the skills that matter. The ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to argue passionately for a position while knowing you might argue against it tomorrow, to be comfortable with the discomfort of never quite landing. So yes, join us. Not because we have it figured out, but because we're getting better at the figuring. Not because we've solved the problems of L&D, but because we're learning to play with them rather than against them. Not because we've transcended the contradictions, but because we've learned to surf them. In the end, the question isn't whether you're team empiricism or team humanism. The question is, can you play for both teams sometimes in the same conversation? Can you be the Swiss Army knife of intellectual discourse, sharp when needed, gentle when required, always useful, never just one thing? Welcome to the age of intelligence. Your brain is about to become a lot more interesting. See you at the next symposium, where I shall cheerfully contradict everything I've just said and mean every word of it. Ad astra per aspera, but also per ludum, through difficulty to the stars, but also through play.